back with a very special episode of the International Money Cafe podcast. In today's episode, it's less than a week after the 2024 US elections. And so we want to briefly talk about or do a post election analysis. And part of the reason for us wanting to do this is so we can really talk about what we can control and what we cannot control. The reason we're doing this because we've had from a lot of our clients who are experiencing some type of post-election stress, and the clients we're talking about are foreign-born clients in the US as well as US experts overseas. And I think a big part of this is really maybe some of the promises. Mana said, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know. I think you're right. A lot of the stress is around election promises, around taxes, and maybe also uncertainty around immigration law changes at this point, at least, because it's really difficult to say if those promises can and will be implemented. To not sound presumptuous, Jane and I, have lived experiences. We have been here for many years in the US, and we have navigated many changes to our American dreams, acknowledging, though, that this election is unprecedented in terms of the issues that are at stake. There are, of course, the promises again. The tick jar is going to expire on December 31st of 2025. So there's a whole lot of tax provisions that will or might change starting January 1st of 26. So that's where we are at, Jane.
Yeah, and so one of the things I actually made a post this morning on LinkedIn, and the first thing I said is, let's all take a deep breath. The one good thing is at least we won't see all these political ads anymore. But I also want to say it's okay to mourn and grieve if the results are not really what you expected. The unfortunate thing about elections at any point is half of the group is going to be very unhappy, the other group is going to be very happy, I guess. So if it didn't go your way, I think it's okay to take a few moments, mourn, grieve if this is not what you expected. But more importantly, what we want to do today is talk about what we can control. What do we do now? How do we move forward? How do we ensure that we can continue living our American dream? And so when I talk about the impact of the election, I'm talking about, let's say the specific groups I'm addressing is one, non-immigrant visa holders. We know legal immigration is likely to be tough, and we'll talk about that. We're also talking about people who are outside the US who are thinking of moving to the US. And then, of course, we're also talking about US citizens and green card holders who are abroad, who are outside. And again, we know there are things that are going to come out of this. Mana, so when you think about legal immigration and what we're hearing from immigration lawyers, what are some of the specifics that you've kind of seen or had immigration lawyers talk about?
Some of the specifics that they're talking about at this point is there could be a reduction in visas for F1, which is the student, as you know. The STEM or OPT might be also affected under the F1 visa, and there could be more stringent rules for CPT. The other visas that we are hearing about are the H-1B visas, and these are work visas. As you know, again, these may go through more scrutiny by the Department of Labor. It could be possible, from what we are hearing, that H-4 spouse visas may go back to not being able to work. There is another visa that we are hearing about from immigration attorneys is the L1 visa, which are usually given by multinational companies to their employees who move over to the US. And there could be a possible change there. It could also, again, be possible here that L2 visas, which are spouse or dependent visas may not be able to work, Jane. That's the buzz.
Right. And so, again, we don't know what's going to happen. All we can do is sort of sit back and wait. But the one thing we can control, and we actually have a full episode on this, we've talked a lot about if you're on a non immigrant work visa, the biggest threat to your plan is you losing the job. Because as we've talked about, when you lose a job on a non immigrant visa, and in this case, I'm referring to H1, L1, O1, E3, T, and all those visas, what typically happens is you have up to 60 days where you have to leave the country if you haven't found something else. Talking with immigration lawyers, one of the pieces of advice we've always received from them in the past is it may be possible to switch to another visa. In this case, it could be like the F1 visa, the student visa, which of course means you have to go through the whole process of applying and being accepted by a school, or you could switch to a B1 student visa. Now, what they're saying, there's a possibility that you may not be able to make that switch, which means the chances of when you've lost a job and having to leave the country are likely to go up a little bit. But again, it's speculation. But what can we do to prepare ourselves for that eventuality? So
Yeah,
one of the takeaways is take a deep breath, accept the results. And like I said, it's okay to grieve. But I think there are things we can do. I
yeah,
am telling my clients, and we talked about this before we started the recording the podcast. It's possible that what you've envisioned as your American dream may not work out as planned. Be flexible. I think that's a key thing. Be very,
hmm,
very flexible. Be willing to change and go along with whatever comes up. If there's a possibility you can move to other countries, keep that in mind. Over the weekend, I was chatting with actually somebody who's in the US on F1 OPT, and he was telling me his company is going to try and do the H1B visa for him. But he was also saying to me, if they're not able to do that because they have a branch in Germany, we've talked about me. This is, the person I was talking to actually moving there. So talk to your companies, find out if that's a possibility. Again, it could mean your version of the American dream changes a little bit and you may have to achieve it elsewhere. Uh, Other options, one thing is be prepared financially for anything that may come up. Okay. We're going to talk about the specific financial considerations of what to think about. But in terms of the preparations we're talking about, please, please, please talk to an immigration lawyer. They are likely going to get very busy. This is a time to get on their calendar. And one thing we always caution you about is we're not talking about your company's immigration lawyer. We're talking about an immigration lawyer outside the company. And one of the things they are likely going to tell you if there's a possibility that your spouse can get a work visa, if let's say you're on H1, L1, J, or one of those visas, it's worth absolutely pursuing that possibility. Manasa, what else can you say
yeah.
about? Yeah.
I love the ideas that you just talked about. In fact, I think, speaking of being prepared, I think the best thing to start doing is to become a student of your visa, right? Just know everything that you need to know about your visa. Of course, stay up to date, because we will keep talking about this, but there are many other avenues where you can stay up to date on all of the visa regulations. And another life lesson that we have learned is be ready to pivot if necessary. Assume that there could be a danger of being laid off, and maybe this is where the pivot comes. Start to look at if there could be more specific skills trainings that you could take. Maybe, for example, what's the next hot topic out there? AI. Try and see if that training is available to you. Maybe that's a good investment instead, right? invest in your education or enhancing your skill training or maybe get soft skills. So pivot is a good word here, I think. What do you say, Jane?
I totally agree. And on top of that, and now that you've talked about the specific skills test, start networking as much as you
Hmm.
can. You don't want to wait until your job is gone.
Oh,
Start
yeah.
practicing, yeah, your interview skills. Practice as much as you can, network, get to know people in the industry. So again, when that time comes, if it comes, you're ready to move on to the next gig, for example.
Hmm.
So let's talk about specific financial things to be thinking about. Now we're going to get very, very practical. Okay. So the first thing is, let's make sure you have a really nice emergency fund. And when we talk about an emergency fund, in this case, we recommend 12 months of cold cash. That's all I can think about calling it. We want this money to be very, very accessible. So somebody asked me the other day if maybe they should put it into CDs. But I think you really want these cash accessible. So like a high yield online savings account, somewhere where you can just pull out the money because you're going to need it as you're talking to immigration lawyers, for example. And then the other thing we always add, if it turns out that you need to fly home, let's make sure it's 12 months of emergency funds plus the cost of airplane tickets to your home country, whatever that is. Again, if you have to leave, it's okay. Let's just make sure you're able to make that move. And then hold off on making big purchases. Part of the American dream we know is to buy a home, and we've seen a lot of that. But I would say until we know for sure what's going to happen, until your immigration situation is more permanent, it's really not a good idea to be making very big financial moves. So my suggestion is hold off on making big, big purchases. In terms of investments, prioritize taxable accounts because they give you more flexibility. If your company is offering a 401k, I think it's okay to put some money in, but I would only go up to the match. So you get the free money. But beyond that, I think really put all your money into a taxable account. And of course, when you put it in there, avoid what you call speculative investments. Avoid accounts like, Roth accounts. Those are all retirement accounts. It could be good, but this is where we talk a lot about consider the country where you're going to be, how they're going to treat some of these accounts. So I think keep it simple is really the way to go up to the match and then prioritize your taxable accounts because you want to give yourself flexibility, as much flexibility as you can. And then, of course, if you're thinking of sending money back home, we've had folks say maybe we want to invest home. Obviously, we can't advise you specifically on what investments to make in your home country. You really do need to think about the tax and financial implications in your home country in the US. And I'm sure, Manasa, you have a few things to say about taxes, right?
Of course, absolutely. So, yeah, continue to stay tax compliant. That almost goes without saying as you're making all these plans and possibly thinking of what other things you can add to your skill set. But most important is remember, you know, if you're sending money back home, there are the F bars and the FATCA if you cross those thresholds. And of course, if you're investing back home, then there are the mutual funds and other things as well. And to Jane's point earlier, if the Roth and the 401ks also come with their special tax considerations if they are left in the US and you have moved back home. So, but then, by the way, speaking about sending money home and foreign assets, we have heard from quite a few people that are looking to move abroad. And these are US citizens or green card holders who did not like how the election turned out. So the stats are actually crazy. When I look it up, Jane, I've heard it's about 1,500% of people,
Increase.
a jump in the number of people thinking of moving
Um,
abroad. And I believe these are countries like Canada and New Zealand and Australia and UK, which is totally understandable because these are all English speaking countries. But that statistic was kind of mind blowing. This is a trend we have already seen in recent years. And irrespective of this election, there have always been people looking to move abroad. And in fact, recognizing this trend, we had already decided to dig deeper into this. And in fact, we've already recorded one episode that will be coming out soon. And there's another one we have already planned for. So if that is your plan of moving abroad for a few years, then remember there are continuing tax and compliance requirements if all tax laws remain the same. So that's where we are going with right now, Jane. And yeah,
yeah. And the other thing, now that you mentioned that, anytime you think about moving abroad or even here, the other thing that comes to mind is, as part of being prepared for anything, is let's make sure your estate plan is in place in the US. And one thing I like to say to everybody, you don't have to have $1 million to have an estate plan. The state already has an estate plan for you if you don't tell them what you want to do. And so the things we're talking about is, if you have kids who are under 18, you want to make sure you have guardians in place, right? You've appointed guardians in place. And it's very possible to have international guardians. I actually have a post on that, and maybe we'll link to it. You may just need to work with an international estate lawyer to make sure you can get that in place, because that's a question that comes up a lot. Who do I name as my kid's guardian? So you also want to make sure you have things like your medical will, your powers of attorney, powers of authority. You want to make sure you have all that in place, regardless of what happens. So this is just good financial planning, but in all situations, this is even more critical that you have all these things in place. One of the sad things that we've seen, and I think you've also had that case, Manasi, one of the few cases we've been talking about is where somebody passes away outside the country, or they were here and the family is overseas, and they really do not have anything put in place. And now their family is really suffering, trying to figure out what are the next steps. You know what I'm talking about?
oh yeah, yeah. The dying intestate.
Yes, yes.
Yes, and if that this really becomes an issue when, and this is sadly something that Jane and I have seen time and again, is the people who are left behind have no means of knowing what to do and how to connect. And that's compounded by the problem that there was no will or even beneficiaries, so many times are mentioned.
Mhm.
And that becomes a really difficult thing. Would you, at this point, Jane, recommend term life or maybe disability insurance? Would you want to talk about that though?
Yeah, that's a good one. But before I talk about that, you mentioned beneficiaries. Yeah, let's make sure all accounts have beneficiaries. That's
Hmm.
absolutely key. So now when it comes to life insurance, that's the other one that we recommend everybody has. But if you, let's say you're in the US on a non-immigrant work visa, you always have hopefully what the company is giving you, but we've been recommending having extra. The key thing is to go with a company that's willing to pay your family regardless of where you end up dying, right? So make sure you have extra life insurance. That's not a problem. Again, now you're really thinking of your family. And all you really need is to have a US account that can continue to be used for premium payment. So that's not an issue. Extra disability, that's a little bit of an issue, because what we found is, when, let's say, you become disabled and you can't work anymore, you need to stay in the country for the companies to pay you that money. And so if you're not able to work and so you're forced to leave the US, it's going to be really challenging for you to then have to travel back to the US so you can get the certification from the doctor. So at this point, it may not be worth doing the extra disability outside of
Mhm.
work. Just go with whatever your company gives you. Besides that, what else? What else should we be talking about?
I think also, Jane, maybe we do have an entire episode on this, but I think we should briefly mention that here is, if you're going to leave the US but you still have US assets, you should be thinking about locking your credit so that nobody can touch your financial accounts, and then of course update your address if you have to leave. And yeah, that's I think like the couple of things that what comes to my mind. Do you have anything else to add, Jane, at this point?
No, I think this is, I don't want to say a continuing saga, but I think there's going to be more that's going to be coming up. And as more things come up, and as we get more information, and as we figure out how to help our clients and prospects, we'll be adding more onto this. At this point, what we'll say is we're very lucky, we've made it this far. Things are still very peaceful. Just put your head down and let's wait and see what happens.
I
Thank you.
agree. I agree. Yeah. Stay tuned, dear listeners, and we'll bring you more updates as we get them. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the International Money Cafe podcast. The content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for professional advice. Seek the advice of your qualified service